Okay, we are recording. Let me see if this is audio.
Yeah, I see the green going.
Good bars. Okay, good. All right, so we are here today with Colleen Billiot. We're in Jefferson, Louisiana. Today is February 16th, 2024, and this is in the series of Language Keeper interviews. We just signed the permission slips for this interview. The copyright for this interview is going to Colleen. Colleen has granted us a limited license to use this interview publicly on YouTube. After this interview, I will give a copy and edit to Colleen so that she can see if she wants it or any edits to it, and we'll work back and forth until we find one that can be publicly published on YouTube, and then it'll be available on the website, and unless she wants it a different place. I think that's all of the front matter, so we can hop right into it. So Colleen, can you start off by just telling us your life story in about 5 minutes?
Oh, okay. Well, let's start with we're here for language. So aleto, sayuth chefuya Colleen, umasaya, sempanarda mentele. So hello, my name is Colleen, and I'm Homa, and I'm from St. Bernard. So if we're talking about life, that's where it all starts, right? So I grew up in Lower St. Bernard. I grew up in a place called Violet. But the Homa side of my family was even further in rural St. Bernard, and literally it's called St. Bernard. It's right by Toka. And I lived there up until Katrina. And it ties into my language work. I have to say I was the one of my family who really got involved with my culture through my papa. For anyone who watches this on YouTube, papa is like grandpa, but it's just our way of saying it. So my papa Pete, who also at one point served in our tribal council, every once a month on a Saturday would pick me up from my mom's house and put me in the car, and we'd pick up some of his cousins and we would go to a tribal council meeting. So I really did. I got to grow up knowledgeable of my culture and aware of it and very proud of it. He always wanted us to be proud of who we were. And so I lived there until Hurricane Katrina. High school was fun. It was an interesting time. Spent a couple years in Folsom, Louisiana. Ended up back in the area to go to Tulane University for my undergrad, where I studied international relations and German, because I thought I wanted to work for the State Department, and then realized that I didn't want to have to move all that often. So went to grad school in DC, and that's really where the language work starts to come into play as grad school. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. But I did go to Georgetown in DC. I studied conflict resolution, which did set me off on a path not about just language revitalization, but even into my career. I ended up writing a lot about state and sub-state issues in terms of sovereign indigenous nations, their relationship with the federal government, everything from the importance of cultural revitalization to community cohesion, to why we need to close the digital divide in Indian country for not only the betterment of indigenous peoples, but for security in the US. And went back home, met the person interviewing me, met Haley. We started Homa Language Project, and that's been almost 11 years. It'll be 11 years in April. So started Homa Language Project 2013, have been working on it ever since, and in 2019, began working on reviving a cultural traditional gathering of the Homa called Tasso Time. Unfortunately, there's this little thing that called COVID that came up, and so we couldn't meet in 2020. We didn't get to meet until 2022, and had our first Tasso Time in around a century or more. And it was open to all indigenous peoples, but it does show off Homa culture and southeastern cultural things that carry across the region. And what else do I do? Oh, I work in communications, so I've worked for the Administration for Native Americans. I currently work for a national Native nonprofit called the American Indian College Fund. I just got accepted as a part-time PhD at Tulane to do linguistic anthropology, because obviously I work with native language. But really I've been very fortunate. I've lived overseas. I've lived in several parts of the US, and just the ability to get back to working with native peoples and to see people from all over has been really great for me. So I'm back home. I'm in my tribal district. I'm with family. I spend a lot less time, PTO and money getting home since I'm based here now, and get to do good things.
Right. So you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking, that you said that Georgetown was really a beginning of this, but could you walk us through exactly when did you feel like you wanted to get involved with language work, and why was it language work that you were really drawn to?
Yeah, I can tell you, I will give the backstory, but the big thing is it was Bambi and Arapaho. So right before I ended up going to grad school, my father was getting sent to Afghanistan to teach or train Afghani police. And he had this copy of my great-grandmother Elvira Billiot doing interviews and singing, as they say, in Indian. And also another woman, Valentine Dardar, singing in Indian. And he wanted me to have that, to hold on to it for him when he went to Afghanistan. And so I had this cassette, and then I started my training at Georgetown, I started my master's at Georgetown. And one of the first things I started looking at was, what is it called? Like a journal publication that I had to read, which was called Bambi and Arapaho. And it talked about a man who had worked with Disney and worked with Arapaho speakers in his community to dub Bambi into Arapaho. And he talked about not only how beautifully, apparently, Arapaho fit with the mouth movements of the cartoon, but like what that did for his community. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole researching, how beneficial language is to Native peoples. So in general, language is a part of culture. We've seen, through numerous studies, having that tie to culture and tradition provides a positive identity or a positive view of oneself for Native students, Native youth. And it creates like a protective factor for them. And that's really critical when you consider that some states have an epidemic of Native youth suicide. And so I saw a lot. I didn't know that at the time. I learned that over years, but I knew that I liked the cultural cohesion, the community cohesion. And this was something that I felt, our people would really be interested in, and they would want, and they could bring benefit and bring value. So I had this cassette and I had this crazy idea and went back home and started talking about it. And then by the time I graduated from my master's program, I ran into Haley at a tribal council meeting. And she had been wanting to do something with the community. You had also just moved back from your master's. And I was like, well, I have this crazy idea and a cassette tape, so I'll play it for you and let's see what you think. But really you were critical in that too, because we had to kind of try and clean up and digitize that recording. And I think in terms of what you're doing with, talking about when you take oral histories and digitize them and who owns things, Homo Language Project is unique in that we are 99.9% of the time virtual. Most of our records are digital in nature. And so we've always kind of been in that sphere.
So like you mentioned earlier that you've been at this for 11 years, with the Homo Language Project, but this is something that started with Bambi or started during your studies. So you've had a long breadth of time within this space, and it's always difficult. I think people are always reticent to, they feel like it's cocky or something to talk about the things that they've done that they're really proud of. But I think it's really important to name those things, especially for people who are listening to this who may not know you or may not ever engage with the beautiful things that you've put forward within the world. So could you, take the humble hat off and talk about some of the highlights of your work over the past few years?
Yes, I can talk about them, but I still want to say it's not one person. And I think, so sorry. I think that's the wonderful thing about having Homo Language Project. Well, I'm just going to say HLP. I hope that's, easy to follow. That we have a really solid team now. And I think for the first several years, it was Haley and I, and we did have some interns from LSU for a while, but we really have that primary linguist, Ben, if Warren would, if he's watching this at some point. It was just the three of us. And then I think around 2018, we got more people. And it's not to say we weren't doing work before then, but it was slower because there's only so much bandwidth any individual has, let alone just three individuals against the mountain of work that is language reclamation. And that is something I would point out before I even get further into the answer, is that if you do any sort of language revitalization or reclamation, they're different. I'm happy to explain them. Understand that these are lifelong projects and they're not even just your lifetime. I mean, to not only bring back a language from dormancy, but to then make sure that it's going to be utilized and it's going to persist into the future. That's something that carries down generations. And one of the things I like to point out is it took us centuries to lose our language. It's going to take centuries to make sure it's as vibrant as it can be, or generations at the least. So I think, a lot of what I would point out are things we've done in the past few years. We've definitely been the speakers and presenters at a few different conferences. So on the academic side, we've been very fortunate that we've talked with linguists, and including native linguists from across, not just our region, but across the US. Several of our team members have gotten to go to Colleen. I'm sorry, I cannot tell you what Colleen stands for. That's way too long of an acronym. But really, it's been the tools that we're using. It's been seeing the number of people that we're able to interact with. I think, and Haley, you're one of the ones that spearheaded this, having the intern program has been great. And we now have our first comprehensive language learning tool in 7,000 languages. I think that that's been really good. But I think the accomplishment is just seeing the community use the language. Having newsletters come out from the tribal office, or hearing the tribal chief, or principal chief is the official title, using hello and goodbye, or talking about chanchuba, talking about alligator. I'm going to backtrack and side note again, chanchuba, alligator, is very important to us because the song that my great-grandmother and Valentine Dardar, Elvira and Valentine were singing was chanchuba. It was the alligator song. So, seeing the community start to use the language and having them ask us how you say things. We've had an intern whose family sent us a question because they wanted his birthday cake to be, to say happy birthday in Uma. A really diligent Walmart employee apparently called them to be like, I don't know what this is. Is this accurate? Is this what you want on the cake? But he got to have that. We've never had someone have happy birthday in Uma on their birthday cake before. And it brings together generations too. And I think that that's great, that we have elders, some of whom they remember their grandparents knowing maybe one or two words and more like yama and the trade jargon, but they can understand us and we can understand them. And really that connection with just other relatives from other tribes too, I think is really cool that I could, I'll share this story. It probably makes people want to laugh at me, but that's why I like to share it. I actually was just at the Legislative Summit for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium in DC, and the very last day they asked a Choctaw elder to do the final prayer before we all dispersed and got on our planes. But I kept understanding the words, and so I was translating in my head, and so everyone else said amen at the end, and I was so excited I clapped before I realized what I was doing. But I understood. And we're relatives of the Choctaw, so it's really cool. It's just another way of connecting. And I think that it helps me personally on my journey, because there's a lot that you learn from your language and a lot of perspective that's in there. So I gave you some of the formal academic things, and then there's like the personal.
Can you talk a little bit more about the personal things?
In terms of like the perspective and stuff like that? Yeah. So one of the things I always share when people ask me about Uma and just Muskogean languages in general is, these are verb-focused languages. It is very much about the action and not the actor. And I think in English and Romance languages, the noun, the person who is doing it, that's a lot more important. So I think it kind of takes your ego out of it a little bit. It's not about who you are, it's about what you do, which I think makes sense, right, for collective societies. But also too, things like we don't have a word for please in Uma. And also when you receive a medicine, like you're not supposed to say thank you to a traitor. They'll sometimes even take it back if they're trying to give you something, because there should never be that hierarchical situation. You should never have to ask your community for something that you need or for something that's going to help you, especially if it's something like medicine. And I think that carries down into the language. And so it's a reinforcement, right, of that cultural norm of like, there is no word for please, because you shouldn't have to beg for that which you need. And I think that's really beautiful. But yeah, I think it is a way, to connect us with not just the relatives from other tribes, but to our ancestors. Like there are things that we say that even the Homa French speakers, elders will say, oh, the way it flows sounds like how we speak Homa French. For those who don't know, I'm going to throw you another side note. Homa French is actually different than other dialects of French in Louisiana. It has been preserved in how it is spoken since our people learned it at the end of the 17th century. So from like 1680, I'm going to say 87, that could be wrong, but the 1690s into the early 1700s. And it was mostly kept that way because we were the only people down the bayou for a while. And so to have Homa French speakers say, oh, that rhythm sounds right to us, when we know from research on Homa French that the rhythm is Muskogean, it's how Muskogean languages work. And that's why it sounds different from other dialects of French still in the state or the world. That's a really cool thing to hear. So yeah, it ties me to my culture and my people, and I think that's really just a cool thing.
I feel like there's another part. I'm trying to be an impartial interviewer, but I really know some of the things that you did. And could you talk a little bit about the language situation of Uma when you began this project to where it is now?
How we do okay, so
or just generally, like, where was Uma before we started this project?
Dormant.
And where is it now that you're involved with it? Or
okay,
the Homa Language
no, that's
Project
fair. So when Elvira and Valentine did those interviews, and I want to say that was in the 70s, it could be the 80s, don't quote me, I wasn't alive in either of those, I was an 89 baby. When the interviews were done, when the recordings of the songs occurred, they were the last two women, or the last two Homa, known to sing Indian. So they were the only people who knew the Chanchupa song. And that is what, I'll admit, even I was like, oh, it's a dead language. And really, it's not, it's dormant. I've had to learn the lingo. But basically, there were no native speakers and no fluent speakers at the time. And so having that recording in 2013, we really had to start from scratch. And so the thing that I've learned so much about linguistic work through this project. I never thought I would end up working in language, by the way. Like, I love it. Don't misunderstand me. Totally didn't see that when I was in school. But, it's a lot of analysis. It is digging through records, doing interviews with elders, trying to find as many remnants of the language as it was, to then bring it back. And so when I spoke before about, there's a difference between revitalization and reclamation. Revitalization is when you have, say several thousand words or phrases, or you have more audio, and you can bring it back pretty much identical to where the language was, before it went dormant. Where reclamation is more of, you don't have enough to bring it back exactly, but you're going to bring it back as close as possible to what it could have been or what it would have evolved into. And so the most common example of this is like modern day Hebrew. And it was explained to me by a linguist, so no one come at me if I say this wrong. But my understanding is modern day Hebrew, there was ancient Hebrew, so they had some documentation, but they then looked at things like Yiddish and other dialects to figure out what it would look and sound like. And that's what we did with Uma. And so we went from a dormant language where there were two recordings and the women themselves knew they were singing about alligators but couldn't tell you exactly what they were saying, to now you have these comprehensive language learning lessons. We have a few social media things. I really have to get back to our TikTok. I will admit I'm the one that's fallen on that one. But we have people translating and practicing Uma every week. And right now those people are largely Homa Language Project team members, but it's so that we can eventually, we'll get good enough that we can then teach. And when it's why we go to things like Colleen, where there are 2 weeks of workshops where people learn how to better educate and share linguistic knowledge. So it has definitely come a long way from the 80 words and phrases that we had from a gentleman named Swanton, if you want to look him up. Now we have several thousand entries in a dictionary. We want to actually roll out a version of that dictionary in April at Tasso time. Or actually, I'm sorry, I lied. Tasso time is March this year, so in April on the anniversary of HLP. And so we've certainly come a long way. You know, there's full sentences. There's even a couple songs that we've translated. There's poetry that's been done in UMA. There's a short film, but I'll talk more about that later because I think it ties into a future question. So yeah, it's come a long way, and it definitely, it takes all of us. Like I know it's asking about like highlights of my work, but again, I just want to emphasize, like, when it was one or two or three of us, there was no way we could have gotten as far as we have. I think just because your capacity when you're doing this as a volunteer, we're all volunteer. We're HOMA who are spread all over the US because there is unfortunately a growing diaspora of HOMA people. And, you know, three of us alone, it's just, you would have burnt out. I think now we're also better about time management, and like we allow ourselves, you know, we took a break from Mardi Gras, we take a break at Christmas. I think we take like a short summer break sometimes if people need it, but we're able to get more done because we can spread the work out, and that's a lot lighter of a load to carry. You know, it's a lot to say that you're carrying the language goals of your people on your back.
Yeah, and that is quite a heavy burden. And that brings me to the next question of just like, it's heavy. What would make this easier? So what would make your language work, or the HLP what do you think would make HLP language work, or your own life easier, looking in both senses of like in the past, kind of like hindsight is 2020, but then also in the future of just kind of like, what do you wish was out there in the world that could help you with this stuff?
I think part of it is just funding. Like I said, we're all volunteer. You know, we do this trying to be as legitimate and accurate as possible. And we do have a couple of great linguists that we work with, but having the funding so we could help our team go to more trainings and go to things like that, having access to data, not just linguistic data, but I'm talking even in terms of historical documentation that might have a few words here and there. You know, one of the issues is a lot of research or a lot of old, say, French or Spanish journals or, you know, documents are behind database paywalls. And that's always very much frustrated me of like, this is information about our people, but I, as a HOMA, can't read about the HOMA. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Sometimes it's straight up translation. You know, when you're trying to go through old files and go through old documents and you want to see maybe, is this an UMA word, or is this a French thing or a Spanish thing, but you don't speak not only maybe those languages you might speak. You know, Haley, and I think you speak a little bit of French, but it's, you know, do you read and understand the intricacies and some of the colloquialisms of 17th and 18th century French? Because things do change in that documentation. So I think, access, constant 24/7, knowing me, access to people who can translate things for me, funding so our team can take on more training. And I think beyond that, I don't really know. I think that's one of the reasons I'm excited to go into my PhD program, because there are entire courses on the different tools and methods for not only maintaining, but, you know, spreading usage of a native language that I really want to look into. But I would say those are probably the biggest that come to mind. Though, to be fair, I'm not good with that question on the spot. I'd have to think about it a bit.
Okay. Because you're starting your PhD, can you talk a little bit about that journey and what you're hoping to accomplish with that?
Yeah. Again, never imagined I would be working with language. To be fair, the amount of languages I either was required to take in school or then took in college, I shouldn't be surprised because I love languages. Just didn't imagine I would end up working on my native language. But essentially, you know, I think part of it is that I love academia, and I'm going to side note, I think that's one of the interesting takes, oddly enough, that I heard in my master's program this idea that like collective societies focus on the good of the whole at the detriment of the individual as opposed to an individualistic society. I would say, having done all this, that's a complete misunderstanding of what collective society is. Collective society means, yeah, you all have your specific skill sets and interests and passions and talents, but you utilize them for the good of your community, for the collective. And so for me, that's kind of what this is, right? I've always been a nerd. I'll always be a nerd. I love getting to go on a college campus and pour through their library and look at their resources, and just sit in on classes. If I could do that, I would. So I think, the ability to go back to school to learn for the sake of learning, but beyond that, to utilize what I learn to help not only Home Language Project, but just cultural reclamation efforts overall would be a beautiful thing. So I have to give credit to my boss, Dina, because oddly enough, we were sitting at the AHEC Legislative Summit last year, and she said, I think you should go try and get your PhD. And I kind of ran with that. I started asking questions and asking academics that I knew about the feasibility of, even getting into a PhD while working, and how does that look, and, affording it, and things of that nature. And so, yes, I only got the notice. I think I got my official letter that I could sign just over a week ago in DC while I was at the summit, and I signed it pretty much immediately. But I will be studying at Tulane, and I'll be working with this amazing professor, Judith Maxwell, who runs literally the longest running indigenous language program in the country. She works with a language, I went to say in Guatemala. If I get that wrong, Judy, please tell me, I apologize. It's been a Mardi Gras week, y'all. I know we're trying to be formal, but it's Mardi Gras week in New Orleans. But she, has always been supportive of HLP, has always been supportive of, just indigenous peoples, and not only helping them with their efforts, but also getting them into academia and getting their voices raised. So that'll be really exciting. So
that's right. Thinking forward, there's a lot, this isn't easy work, and it takes a lot of effort, and, you need to have a lot of motivation and gumption to kind of get into this field. What keeps you going? Where do you find hope or inspiration in some of the harder times? Yeah.
I will get to that, but I have to say, sometimes it's the work that gets you through, right? Like, sometimes it's just having the routine of meeting several nights a week and doing language translation, and knowing that I get to, check in with the other members of HLP. I will say, I think that's been great, actually, because I think even in the microcosm of HLP, we're still HOMA, or we're adopted HOMA is what I like to tell our linguists, that they're adopted. So when we go through things like Hurricane Ida, we had meetings that weren't actually HLP meetings. They were, let's everyone check in. Where is everyone mentally? What do you need? What's happening where you are on the ground? Because even though we are kind of scattered, some of us still live, in our tribal districts or service area. So I think sometimes, yeah, it's the project that helps you, because that is community, right? Like, that's the whole point of language work. And you really see that even in the language team, it's a bright spot to go back to. You've had a long week, and now I get to go translate and get tongue-tied for an hour. But I think really it's, again, seeing it in the community, and really it's the youth. Not only having an intern whose birthday cake is an uma, but, I said I would get back to this. Ekbe is the first short film ever recorded and produced that's, not only utilizes uma, it's obviously titled in uma, but it has Homa French in it. It's also in English. And it made it to the Sundance Short Film Festival, which is beyond comprehension, to be honest. Mariah is amazing. Never thought I would see that. Haley, I know you're on the other side of the camera, but Haley and I got to see it with one of our linguists, Jack, at the New Orleans Film Festival, and you reached across and grabbed my hand in the dark, and I was tearing up, because it was this young Homa woman doing a film honoring our language, honoring both of really I would consider our traditional languages because we've spoken French for so long, and her grandparents talking about their experiences as Homa. And that was such a powerful, I'm getting choked up talking about it now, that was such a powerful moment of look how far we've come in a decade where this language was dormant and now it's literally in a film festival. Now it's in 2 film festivals. The community desire to keep seeing things come out of this and seeing what the youth are going to do next. You know, what is that, the TikTok thing about teenagers scare the living beep out of me? Like, yeah, they scare me in a good way because they are so far beyond what I could think to do, I think, sometimes in terms of how they're going to use language and where they're going to take it next. So I just get to, you know, keep doing what I'm doing, but watch them run with it, really. We crawled so they can go to Sundance. That's what we did.
2-stepped so they could Sundance.
2-step, yeah. 2-step is a serious thing down the bayou, apparently.
It's really awesome. Yeah, I remember that moment. That was really powerful. I remember when Brittany first showed it too. In our group meeting, she had just gotten all the submissions and she put it in the group chat, and I was just like, oh wow.
Yeah.
It's a really good moment. Well, you know, we're talking about interns, you know, and that kind of brings us to this idea of capacity of, you know, if you had 3 interns, what would you have them focus on?
I'd want one of them purely to be social media, to take over TikTok vocab and finally create all of the memes that I have suggested in our language meetings. Because really there's a lot that comes up that I think people would resonate with. You just have to find how to get them to remember the word, right? And it's a lot of times it's memes. No, I think, you know, again, I think youth just have a different idea of not only what platforms to use, but how to utilize them. So having them run more stuff would be great if there was an intern. If there was 3 of me, I mean, I honestly don't know. I think, you know, going into the PhD is going to help. You know, if I won the Powerball and I wasn't working, even though I love my job, so let's be honest, I'd probably be like, can you handle me part-time? I just translating every day, translating and getting better and finding out, you know, I think the only time we really have grammar questions now, they're really complex grammar concepts, but getting that ironed out so we can really then start offering sort of more formal walkthroughs of the language lessons on 7,000 languages and having a larger group of people meet and learn. Because it's not that we don't want to have that now, it's about capacity. You know, our ability to answer certain questions or just having enough of us there who can accurately answer things. I do think the PhD is going to help a lot, and Ben will no longer have to take so long to explain things to me because I'm always the one with questions going, well, why this way? Is this accurate? You know, is this the traditional way of saying this? Yeah. And then just maybe reaching out to more of the community. I think, you know, we do live in a very digital age, and this is a very digital and virtual project, but when it comes to elders, you know, or just people down the bayou sometimes that are a bit older, like they're not always connected to social media or to the internet in general. I know a great elder who literally doesn't even have his own phone. Half the time he uses his sister as a voicemail. But, you know, that's reaching them and getting them involved and seeing the intergenerational work between the elders and the youth. I think that's always really cool. And then the more you draw in elders, the more that they have things to share, even if they're not directly language, they're cultural and they're anecdotal and it's from their childhood. And so you get these beautiful stories that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, but it takes having them participate and having them share stories and talking with them to kind of jog their memory. Yeah. Oh, that's a good one for what did I wish I know, what would have made it easier. Learning how you have to work within the parameters, I would say, of your culture. So I used to joke, when we first started HLP, I was like, I should have been foreshadowing I was going to get a PhD. It's like, I need to write a paper called Coffee Talk, because with HOMA, especially the elders, we love coffee. And we would go to our elder, Miss Corrine's house. I call her Aunt Corrine, but we'd go to Corrine's house, and you couldn't talk about anything until you had coffee. And then you would talk about family, and it never failed. You'd find that one family member or friend that everyone knew, and you'd talk about them for a bit, and then she might offer you food, and then you'd have more coffee, and then you could ask questions. And any relative's house down the bayou that I go to, like, the first thing they do is they put on the pot of coffee. By the way, microwaved coffee doesn't count. Don't do that. And also meeting them where they are in terms of the terminology. Like, I think, one of the things I heard in DC recently was generationally, the older generations still say things like Indian. Younger generations want to say indigenous, or they want to acknowledge their nation. And there's nothing wrong with that. I totally get it. I say indigenous a lot of the time. With the HOMA elders, again, we were the only people who were isolated for so long. So it wasn't, hey, did any of your elders speak HOMA? They would give you this look of like, no, like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that means. But if you said, did any of your elders speak Indian? They better understood the question. It doesn't mean that the answer was always going to change, but they better understood it. So I think it's just you have to understand who you're working with and understand the community and the culture, and always be respectful of that, But yeah, never turn down coffee. Coffee is the thing that gets you in the door.
Now we're talking, I think that, taking interns to that would be really cool too. That would be an experience. I know that we had one intern that did that. That was almost their entire internship. Shout out to Colin on that one. So, we're talking about having 3 interns, but what if there were 3 of yous? 3 of you, like, you split yourself, you guys are sharing a brain. You can go to 3 different places at once. How would you
One would be at work, one would be doing the PhD, so doing the actual, like, learning of the different reclamation efforts and things like that, the different tools. And then, I think one would literally just be, the third would probably actually be doing constant research. If anyone can get me into the Vatican archives or Spanish National Archives or French National Archives, please find me. But please give me a translator as well, because again, there's a gap there. Because there are tidbits of language in the in the older documentation. But also just the cultural knowledge is important. And I think, I just did a talk on this, when did I do that? In November. And one of my life goals really is to write a comprehensive history of the HOMA, but not from an academic perspective, more like a textbook, right? Where a 10-year-old and a 50-year-old could both take something away from it. But there are a lot more records out there than I think people realize. Again, they're hard to access. They can be behind paywalls. They can be in other countries. They could be in different languages. But I think doing that, would not only, again, bring that sense of pride, that positive identity, but probably find us a few more hints of HOMA as it was, the OG HOMA. And so, I'd probably be doing that. I'd probably be like researching during the day and then translating random sentences into UMA at night to keep up practice. Because that's the hardest thing is if, we meet 4 times a week usually. 3 of those are, now this is just for the language focus team. This is not archiving and people that, do the interviews with elders to learn about their stories. 3 of those 4 meetings are nothing but translation. But if you're away for a week or 2, it's so easy to immediately regress. You have to stay on top of it. So if I could just spend hours translating, I'd probably pull my hair out a little bit, but it would be worth it in the end.
I feel like one thing that HOMA Language Project does, thinking about, we're talking to a bunch of different language groups and thinking about, what do we bring to the table as a group and what do we need to learn from other people and things. Could you talk a little bit about the collective, more about the collective aspect of the Homa Language Project? Because I feel like that's unique to other people that we're talking about. So like, what does being part of a collective mean to you, and how does that manifest?
Yeah. Honestly, the first thing that popped in my head was like, everyone gets a voice. It's not, it's not Haley and Colleen's show just because we co-founded it. It's everyone comes together, everyone works on the things, and I think we do honor each person's not only interest but skill set. Like I said, there are different teams. So we have like this archiving group. You're a part of that. They interviewed Aunt Colleen, oddly enough, and presented her, by the way, with an amazing compilation of the transcripts of those interviews. It was hours of interviews, because she does want to have an autobiography at some point, and presented that to her at the first Tasso time, contemporary Tasso time. So there's archiving, and correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously this is just my perspective. I feel like the sort of language teaching and the reclamation, they kind of, or I should say like the output to community is kind of both archiving and the language group, but there's a teaching aspect to that. But yeah, so there's this sort of middle ground that we all participate in, which is when we're sharing things to the Homa. And then there's sort of the language focused group, which is doing more of the, again, the creating language learning tools, working on the dictionary, to the alphabet challenge. Oh, I forgot an entire letter that day. That was fun. And really, prior to that, when we were a slightly smaller group, we all did the sort of language analysis, which was really cool. If you remember, we had an Excel sheet that went on for days, and we compared UMA, the 80 words and phrases that we had, to Eastern and Western Muskogean dialects. That was actually really cool. But maybe I'm just a nerd, and that's why I think so. So the great thing is everyone finds what speaks to them, what they want to work on. And like our interns, right? It's not like everyone's, we said every intern must make a video. Mariah decided to do a video. Jace did a short story. Jace, by the way, is the intern who had his birthday cake in UMA. Someone else did a song. I'm trying to think of her name, because we ended up translating. I don't think she did a song for her internship, but she did a song that we translated. But so everyone gets a voice. So when we had to make those first critical grammar decisions and alphabet decisions and transcription things, everyone who'd worked on the analysis, everyone who understood and at that point was on the team and had been well-versed, everyone got a vote of, hey, what feels right, what feels accurate in terms of these grammar decisions. We've totally bamboozled some people in the field, with some of our choices, but we always had data and we had a reasoning for it. I think we've stuck to that. But we always also make sure that and I'll again give props to Ben, because Ben always makes sure, if there is like a complex grammar question or a question about adding a new neologism, we have a standing rule of like 2 Homa have to have a say on something. In terms of language, it's often Brittany and I, sometimes it's Ida. Donnie occasionally comes on and just uses humor, which is a very Homa thing. If you've not met a Homa person, come have a conversation with us that isn't formal and academic. We're a riot. But, we always make sure that, again, we're being legitimate, that we're giving everyone a voice, and that everyone's just sort of allowed to really follow their passion. And I think, honestly, I know this is about me, but you're really the leader of that, of making sure that everyone feels welcome, that everyone, kind of can best utilize, again, their passions, their skill set, but still participate in HLP. So I'll never forget, what did you say one day? I said, you were the rock of HLP, and you said I was the roll. And I do think, that's the big thing when you have any sort of project, and you and I have talked about this. I think HLP in general has talked about this and it goes back to, we can't all, one person can't take this on, 3 people can't take this on. We kind of share the weight of it, and you begin to really trust and rely on each other to work on different things, and it comes together beautifully. And yeah, And it all starts to bleed into things. Like I have, TASO time, and half the planning committee for TASO time are just other HLP folks, and you work with Babancha Public Access and Babancha Radio, and Ida works with that as well. And, Ida's got some art things, but like we all try and support each other. But I think it all comes back to HLP. I've never realized this until this moment. I'm having an epiphany. HLP is kind of the heart of that because it's where we all met. It's where we all start. And I think it grants us the ability to then branch out into other things and to then come back and connect it all together. So yeah, even when you're not using the language is bringing the community together. That's your takeaway.
And thinking about, we're talking a lot about HLP as a group, but it takes, there's people who are working on language and then there's people outside. Can you talk a little bit about the people, just kind of who are the language relatives that are maybe not, meeting and coming to all of these meetings, but are definitely supporting, whether they're Homa or other tribes or like other communities? Who are the shout outs that...
How much time you got?
We got 15 minutes.
No, I think, going back to, obviously, our interns are great. Again, we've had a couple principal chiefs really support us, even former chiefs like Brenda Dardar. Okay, now I have to say them all because I said one. We got to be fair. So let's see. Brenda's been there. Wrong name. Thomas Dardar. There we go. There's a lot of Dardars, y'all. He and I spoke when I first went to work in language, and he was like, take it on. Like, he really encouraged me. So props to him. Coco Kerpel, and then Lorianne Chasson, she's our current principal chief. She's spoken, used to Uma. She'll reach out to me sometimes, be like, how do I say this? So tribal council, Donnie was on tribal council for a while. So it was interesting to see like an HLP member up there. But I think just in the community, again, the interns, the elders, the aunties, I sometimes, we have a group, like the 3 aunties, that I reach out to, and sometimes I'll say things in Uma to them. But the linguists, man, the native linguists from our cousins, our relative tribes, Chickasaw and Choctaw, right? So Josh Lakosh Henson with Chickasaw, and then Jason Brightstar Lewis with Choctaw. Could not do the work without them. Like they answer so many questions. I've pulled them into so many meetings to be like, how do y'all say this? How do, is this right? Is this how you would do it? Because again, it's not just that you want to build something back up. It's like, am I doing it accurately to the best of my ability? So they've been great. We've talked to a bunch of academics and linguists. I won't lie, I can't remember all their names right now. It's unfortunate because I can picture one of them. Like I know he's been on our calls. But I'm blanking on names. He's out in Florida. That helps. Is it Mark? No. Aaron Broadwell. Haha, see, I knew you'd get there. Because I certainly didn't. There's a Pam, I want to say. Yes. There's a few people. Y'all, I'm not lying. I'm horrible with names. I mean, it took me a while to get Haley's name, I'm pretty sure. So I'm not the person to ask. I mean, we've used linguistic books from both Chickasaw and Choctaw as well, and they have their own, authors and things of that nature. I will say Marie Crouch, and she speaks French, but she is actually the person who got the individual, I want to say his name is Nicholas Farquhar. I'm glad you know how to say it.
Farquhar, yeah.
So sorry. That studied and found that intonation, the pattern of Muskogean, like Uma overlaying Homa French. But yeah, I think there's so many people. I mean, again, Judith Maxwell, all of the professors at LSU, Sport, and I can't even think of their names.
Lizzie Oliver.
Yeah, Oliver. Oh, I remember her. Yeah, great people. Too many to name, truly. And then you've gotten to go and look at records in Canada, because someone offered, and like the American Philosophic
APS,
Society.
Yeah.
So it's just, we're very fortunate. We always have been. Oh, Babancha Public Radio. or Babancha Liberation Radio, like sitting there and asking us to come on when we're in town, or now that I've moved back, I'm always in town, but come on occasionally and say a few things in Uma and talk about stuff, so.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, is there anything that you feel like burning that we didn't get to talk about yet, but you feel like people need to know, or that's on your mind or heart?
Oh, not about Homa Language Project, but I think a big issue, not just that the Homa face, but I think Indigenous people face, and it comes up any time I think I have conversations, no matter where I am in the country, is like, don't forget that Indigenous people have existed in the Southeast this whole time, that we're still here, that, we have our own cultures, and it's worthwhile to not only preserve what we have, but reclaim things that, maybe have been sleeping. And then for anyone interested in language work, be it Indigenous or not, but just especially for Indigenous language work, remembering there's a saying about, our culture's it's never dead. It's asleep waiting for you to awaken it. And I think, we kind of prove that, right? Like we've literally brought something back, and we're already seeing the good in our community. And so it's always worthwhile. It's always worth doing. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't get frustrated. Again, these are lifelong projects. There's never going to be an end date. There's no like the top of Mount Everest where you're like, okay, I'm done and I can stop now. I'll be working on HLP until the day I walk on to the next life. And I'm totally good with that. Like that's part of my life, and I love it.
I think that's it, but are you okay with that, Billiot?
Yeah, I'm good. I just wish I'd realized it was on video. I would have worn my gar scale earrings.
I know. I'm so sorry. I thought that
You're
was
fine.
weird. Yeah.
I was also out of town for a week. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Cut. I hope that was